Hello. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, winner of Man Most Likely to Have a Peasant of Their Very Own award in my school's yearbook. If you're watching this on Bin Man's channel, this may be somewhat confusing as I've hijacked things for a minute. I mean, obviously, if you're watching this on my channel, then you'll have no idea why this is confusing, which in itself will be confusing. An excellent start. Look, let me try and explain. I saw an article the other day on Top Gear which said something like, here are the top most evil cars of all time. For reasons apparently down to Americans, there were things like the truck that Timothy McVeigh used to blow up the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma, and the truck that Bin Laden's boys tried to use to blow up the World Trade Center before they figured out that aeroplanes are basically flying atrocity bombs, and we all had to get our underpants swabbed 15 times before even looking at a departure gate. Anyway, it made me think. I'm basically pretty evil, and I like cars, so perhaps I could do a list of the most evil cars from history. How hard can it be? Naturally, I was going to do this single-handedly, but Jenkins then pointed out to me that I needed to be more inclusive. Seeing me look confused, he explained that these days it's the done thing to bring someone younger, poorer, and less fortunate, and maybe even ginger into discussions, into topics from time to time. This left me at something of a quandary. I don't really know many young people, much less young people who would consider themselves to be inclusive. I mean, obviously there's Laserbig, he's Scottish, I mean that's basically ethnic I suppose, but he's rather busy doing tank stuff these days. Then there's Anamaki, he's Australian, but I mean that is basically an Englishman who's got somewhat lost and likes to get bitten by poisonous wildlife. Now, I need somebody from real ethnic enclave, and ideally somebody who knows something about cars. And then, of course, it hit me. What's the most evil thing in the universe? No, it's not that. Nor that, nor those, definitely not that. Look, stop. It's a Dalek, alright? I mean, of course it's a bloody Dalek. So who uses a Dalek as their avatar, and is young, and knows a lot about cars, and is probably from an endangered tribe? Well, obviously I thought about Intergalactic Bin Man. He's so young, he probably doesn't remember rotary phones. He knows more about cars than he has any right to, frankly. And he's from the Democratic People's Republic of Yorkshire. I'm not sure if he's ginger, but let's assume that he is and get on with this. And thus we have the Hardthrasher Bin Man Alliance presenting the 5 most evilest cars we can think of, which means actually we came up with 10, only we didn't. Catchy title, eh? Look, fuck you, this is our channel. Our channels. These are our... Whatever. The format is quite simple. We each went away, picked 5 cars, and now we will present them back to you, alternately, until we have crowned the most evil car of them all. As ever, do feel free to like and subscribe and so forth, or just leave this running in the background on repeat until you wake up. We're good with that too. First of all, Bin Man, hit me up with your least most evilest car.
Group B is hailed as a golden age by many enthusiasts. It was a time when some of the most iconic drivers to ever take the wheel piloted the most ridiculously overclocked vehicles through crowds that parted like the Red Sea in their wake. It was a spectacle that can never exist again, as numerous high-profile accidents led to the FIA taking notice and clamping down, introducing safety regulations that kept fans away from the track and reduced maximum power outputs. Some so-called enthusiasts, who would be able to count the number of brain cells on 2 hands if they knew that numbers went that high, decry this, whining that Group B should never have been killed off, or worse still, should make a return. Now, I like Group B as much as the next guy, but all I have to do was point at the cars to show why it was a terrible idea. We're talking sub-1 ton, 500 plus horsepower over-boosted death machines that bounced along dirt and snow tracks at near light speed, all while manufacturers and teams constantly broke the rules to make the cars even lighter and more dangerous if it meant shaving another 1/10 of a second off the route time. The result was a collection of race cars with handling so unpredictable and power delivery so brutal that they held a deep and burning, passionate hatred for human life rivaled only by the Allied master computer. They seethed at the very idea that you and every other person on the planet were not reduced to a spam-like paste. As such, they would take any opportunity to act upon that fantasy, wrestling with drivers desperate to stay in line and keep themselves and others alive. It was only a matter of time before the cars won through, and in one particularly deadly incident, Joaquim Santos lost control of his Ford RS200, veering into a crowd at the 1986 Portuguese rally, injuring 31 and killing 3. This accident was one of the main reasons cited for the FIA's termination of Group B. Barring a brief return via Rallycross, the cars have since been mostly kept in storage. The truly apoplectic rage that these cars must have regarding their imprisonment, sitting quietly in a warehouse in the knowledge that outside humans lived freely, never facing the threat of being eviscerated by a turbocharged 1980s death machine, is one that we can never fully comprehend. It can only be heightened by the fact that when they are briefly allowed to unleash their fury upon the world once again, modern safety regulations have reduced racetracks to the equivalent of a soft play area for them. Like watching a mad serial killer in a padded cell, they can thrash and scream all they want, but the chances they will ever harm another human being are scarce. We can only sit by the sidelines and look on in quiet disconcertion, knowing what would become of us if they got their way. Okay, now I've proved I'm right, you pick something.
You know that's not a car, right? That's a set of cars. Okay, fine, whatever. I can't believe you don't like Group B rally cars, but you can't even remember the 1980s. I do. Happy days spent sniffing. Actually, do you know what? I'm not going to go any further with that. There might be kiddies or, worse yet, police officers listening. Talking of fascist tools of the state, my turn. The Defender. Now, I realise that the Land Rover Defender has its defenders. These people are typically in a Venn diagram. They are short, they think the British Empire is still a thing, and or they have biceps developed over years of humping bales of hay around. Strictly speaking, the Defender name only emerged in the 1980s, but I want to really upset everyone by simply ignoring that and claiming that it's been there since 1948 when the Land Rover Series 1 first launched. The Series 1 was shit at the time and has remained shit in all of its derivatives since. It is cramped, it is unreliable, the panels have never fit once so it leaks, the older series are stupidly easy to steal, it was light originally but has ballooned in weight over the years, it's never really been much cop off-road, the driving position is literally less comfortable than a T-34 tank, the pedals are offset and thus almost useless, its gearboxes have always been a nightmare of grinding metal and failure, the engines have either been massively underpowered or unspeakably thirsty, or in some cases both. If you are over 6 foot you won't be able to do anything with your right arm except stick it out of the window, which is bad in summer and fucking awful in winter. The removable roof has always leaked in every single model that they were fitted to until they were dropped, and they're fantastically overpriced compared to much better options like the Suzuki Jimmy or the Skoda Yeti. Rubbish though it is and always has been, this isn't actually why it's evil. No, the reason it is evil is because some people who have done a lot of bad things have used it over the years, and a great number of folks have been killed by one or in one. In the 1960s, as the empire came down, on top of selling a lot of newly independent countries shiny cipher machines that we happened to have the back door to, we also sold them a lot of Land Rovers. Many of these regimes, and I know this might come as a galloping shock to some of you, were fantastically corrupt and spent a goodly amount of time pulling the teeth and fingernails out of their populations. As a result, the Land Rover can be seen in the background of many Cold War coups, counterinsurgencies and civil wars. Basically, before the Yanks hit their stride with the Hummer and the Japanese started to sell aftermarket AA guns for the back of their Hilux in the 1990s, various flavours of Defender were like a sort of malignant army of evil stalking around the globe and causing either RSI or facilitating the activities of the local secret police. And then to top it all off, they went to Iraq and Afghanistan with the British Army, where they discovered the true meaning of the term soft-skinned, when they hit a lot of local IEDs, killing and maiming many young boys who should have come back again to the United Kingdom with their faces and hands, but didn't because the British government hadn't upgraded their vehicles since the 1980s. Don't spend your life trying to fix one of these shitboxes, get a Toyota. Top that, my friend.
Going for the war angle early, I see. I'm saving that for later. To avoid the legion of angry farmers you've just invoked that are now making their way to the city, I'm picking the worst example of corporate misanthropy that desecrated one of the greatest names in automobile canon. Chrysler has, since the late 70s, been the sick old man of the American Big Three. Lee Iacocca spent a decade and a half at the helm, tirelessly wrestling success from the jaws of a messy bankruptcy, and by the early 90s had placed Chrysler in an unquestionably powerful position. Naturally, the rest of the board grew resentful and fired him, and by the end of the 90s, Chrysler had stagnated once more and was looking for a quick out before it went down the shitter again. Enter fucking Mercedes, who began a notoriously disastrous partnership with Chrysler before the former wisely got the fuck out of Dodge. Do you get it? Do you get it? It's like, because Dodge is like a brand that Chrysler had. Do you understand the joke? Do you get it? Leaving the latter with bugger all yet again. After going bankrupt in the face of the 2008 crisis, Chrysler found itself being pulled from the rubble by an unlikely scavenger, Fiat. This began a relationship that would ultimately result in the highly peculiar Fiat Chrysler, subsequently followed by the Cronenbergian monster commonly referred to as Stellantis, but that's outside the scope of this list. Chrysler had, for a while, been trying to move upmarket in Europe, most notably with the Chrysler 300, which, slightly shoddy build quality aside, was a pretty okay car all things considered. Yes, a good friend, Anna Markey, who I would quite like to stay friends with, does own one. Why do you ask? Yes, it's big, bold, brash, and about as precise as a censored CIA report, but that's what you sign up for when you're buying an American car. By all accounts, it was a leather armchair that really shifted when you wanted to, and if that's what you're looking for, then it did the trick and then some. However, Chrysler's brand power had been dragged through the mud following the Mercedes debacle. Fiat seemed to offer the perfect solution by bringing a few brand names to the table that it wanted to premiumize for greater profit margins. A simple badge swap and Bob's your uncle, success! What was the brand the 300 was marketed under, may I ask? What? Lancia. Makers of some of the prettiest, most elegant and revolutionary cars to grace the road. Makers of rally monsters like the dainty little Fulvia, the mid-engine Stratos, and the bar-setting Delta Integrale. Even some of their boring executive cars got some exotic flavor, like the achingly beautiful Flaminia and the Ferrari-powered Thema. You're going to take this brand, with provenance that built the image of Italian automotive finesse, and slap it on a hulking, squared-off macho machine designed to make Midwestern housewives go, "Oh, now that's a fancy car." A car that's built in Canada on a Mercedes platform that was over a decade old at the time. This is what we're giving to one of the vehicular goats. Sure, Lancia had fallen off by the 2010s, but that doesn't justify this. The Chrysler 300 was built on principles entirely antithetical to those of Lancia, which, while not a bad thing on its own, was downright offensive badge engineering. But aside from defiling Lancia's name, what makes the Lancia Thema 2 truly evil is that Fiat and Chrysler thought they could get away with this. They treated the general public with such utter contempt that they thought they could just swap the badge on a car they'd been selling up until that very same year as a Chrysler, and that no one would notice. Well, they did. And after pitiful sales, the Lancia Thema 2 ceased production after just 3 years, causing such catastrophic damage to the Lancia name in the process that to this day it is only sold in Italy, with their only product being the Ypsilon, little more than a hoard-up Fiat 500. Only until fairly recently have talks about a Lancia revitalization taken place, although looming threats of mark-axing from the Stellantis higher-ups put those plans in jeopardy. We could be facing the snuffing out of yet another timeless, iconic part of the automotive world, and it is this car's fault.
Okay, I'll admit that is a strong choice, but if you really want to kill a car mark off and you want a car that's going to dissolve the moment that there's a hint of rain, I think you can look no further than the god-awful Austin Montego. For those of you that don't hail from these shores, the Austin brand will mean very little, but it was one of the pioneers of motor manufacturing, with a long and proud history which was killed dead by this piece of shit. Anyone in Britain who was unfortunate enough to be ferried around in a Montego will have unpleasant memories of sitting on the side of fast-moving motorways, watching smug bastards in German, Italian and, God forbid, even Japanese cars sailing blithely by as you awaited rescue with your piece of crap that British Leyland had sold you, or was it worse that you bought second-hand off someone who invariably said something like, "It's a lovely little runner," whilst knowing full well that it had never run well from the day that it was partially assembled in Coventry. The only thing that was reliable about the Montego was its ability to utterly destroy a family holiday and be the cause of divorce amongst thousands of British families. Advertised as the world's first computer-assisted car with apparently more compute power than the lunar lander, this monstrosity first appeared on British roads in 1983, and for reasons that surpass all human understanding, it was made for nearly 10 years, during which, despite starting out as a motoring monstrosity, it somehow got progressively worse with each update. The crime here is the death of Austin, which had been going since the very first years of motoring and had produced its very first vehicles in 1905. In the 1930s, it launched the revolutionary Austin 7, a car which put motoring within the reach of the majority of British households who could, for the very first time, own their own car. The 7 was Britain's answer to the Beetle or the Model T, only without the Nazi stuff. In the 1950s, Austin teamed up with Healey to make the fantastically beautiful Austin Healey Sprite, a car which brought style and even a bit of fun to British roads and British families who could actually start to afford a second car. It is hard to describe just how beautiful and wonderful the Austin Healey Sprite is in the flesh. Let's put it this way. I briefly had custody of one in the 1990s, and the bonnet, when I returned it, had a dent with curves that mysteriously matched her ladyship's posterior perfectly. In the 1960s, now in league with Morrison as part of BMC Corporation, Austin developed and built the fantastic Mini, a car which would be built for more than 30 years and invoked the spirit of the 1960s with its brilliant transverse engine, clever layout and city-friendly motoring. The Mini in its original form before being force-fed Brustwurst by the dastardly Germans was just 10 foot long, and it delivered more than 50 miles to the gallon, with a wheel on each corner and ground clearance so low that anyone in it could feel every rut and bump and pothole on British roads. It captured hearts across the world. They made more than 1 million of these things before the 60s was out, and 5 million of them before they stopped production. The slight challenge was that Austin, and later British Leyland, somehow managed to lose money on every single car. And this was pretty symptomatic of the kinds of issues that British Leyland vehicles suffered from. The crapfest that was the Montego didn't come out of thin air. See, the Mini and, even the Montego did have some seriously interesting innovations, and they were very technically advanced. But they also had panels that didn't fit, they had engines that were so anemic slight inclines were a challenge, production lines run by committee in factories ruled by unions, and an executive board with more ego than brains. The Montego was supposed to fix all of these issues, but instead it finally killed off the Austin brand. It was slow, unspeakably unreliable, rusted at the slightest hint of rain, and its computer brain was closely linked to that of HAL off 2001 Space Oddity, in that it liked to kill the owners of the vehicle. Prone to spontaneous combustion, backfiring and crankshafts that would leap bodily out of the bonnet at motorway speeds, and of course styling so ugly that even 1980s Japanese cars looked good by comparison, it was a truly awful vehicle, and it finally killed off any love that the British public may have had for the manufacturer. This, in turn, allowed Ford Mondeo and then BMW 3 Series to start to dominate British roads in serious volumes, meaning although we'd won the war, Stuttgart won the peace. May it and all involved in its design be consigned to a specific circle of hell in which they are perpetually trying to reach their mother-in-laws for Christmas with screaming children in the back, whilst their bastard car won't start and their partner gives them the silent treatment.
Grant you, the Montego is pretty damn miserable, but as you pointed out, it at least had some effort put into it. There was hope, and some people involved really tried, which is admirable, maybe? Also, the MG Montego Turbo was a pretty cool piece of kit, although now over-speculated by a preposterous group of people with entire rooms dedicated to their anorak collection.
The people who buy it be unable to afford school fees or private healthcare under the third generation. It will perhaps not totally surprise you that whilst you, Binman, have chosen a car that is basically a narcissistic nightmare for the elite, I am going to pick a car which is aimed squarely at the masses. The Model T Ford is held up as one of the automotive world's greatest ever achievements. It easily outproduced its competitors, it established Detroit as the heart of motoring manufacturing, it is the thing which created mass motoring for the United States for the very first time and possibly anywhere in the world. And it probably never farted in a lift. If you were unlucky enough to be forced to study various business manuals of the 1980s and 1990s as I was, and hear Build to Last springs to mind, then Ford was sometimes held up as an exemplar of how a business could not just define an era, but define business itself. Moreover, the Model T was produced by a lone wolf of an entrepreneur, and stop me if any of this sounds even vaguely familiar, but Henry Ford was a self-made man. He was an innovator, he cared for his workers, he wanted to challenge industry norms, and he wanted to create a single amazing product that covered the plethora of failed business ventures he'd had in the past, unsavory ideas that he held in his head, and his general mental instability that would have seen him, under normal circumstances, under medical supervision if it wasn't for the fantastically huge quantities of money that he had. Sound familiar? No, of course it doesn't. I don't want to get sued or called a paedophile on Twitter, so me neither. Anyway, where was I? Yes, I was taught that Henry Ford invented the production line, the time and motion study, and the quality versus cost principle. I learned that in 1913 he paid his workers the insane sum of $5 a day, and so they could afford to buy the products that he was selling. That he asked if I asked consumers what they wanted, they would have told me they wanted a faster horse or some such gnomic nonsense. He was held up as a shining example of what an innovator, an entrepreneur, and a benevolent capitalist should be. He was, okay, let's move on. Okay, so my problem with the Model T and why I think it's so evil is not really so much the car itself, if I'm honest. honest, although there are plenty of faults here, the petrol tank was under the front seat, so if you crashed pretty much any time, it was guaranteed to burn you and your children alive. There was a flat windscreen, which was made of normal glass, meaning that in a crash, either that glass would come screaming towards you and any of your passengers and cut you to pieces, or alternately, because there were no safety belts, you would go towards that glass and be cut to pieces. They were highly unstable, and at speed, if you turned the wheel, they would simply flip over and crush and kill all of your passengers like a can being stamped on. Ford, being Ford, created his own proprietary way of controlling the vehicle, so the pedals were all in weird and wrong places, the clutch is completely bizarre, and it has a kind of hand throttle that's almost impossible to control, meaning you really had no control over your speed. None of this is the point. The car is not evil because of these things, but because Ford chose to put these things in his vehicle, and when people started to die, he simply ignored it and carried on making money. And if that was all there was, well, he'd just be a rich arsehole who rolled a 6 in life, and we could probably just move on. But it isn't. You see, Henry didn't do all the things I listed at the start there. No. For example, he paid his workers $5 a day, which works at about $40,000 a year as it is, which sounds pretty good, but for that you had to agree to work 6 days a week, doing an unskilled repetitive job on his shop floor. You also had to be married, and your wife wasn't allowed to go out and earn any money of their own. In fact, she had to stay inside the home at all times, and you both had to speak English. See, workers were being forced by Henry's invention of the time and motion study and his fear of the unions to do exactly the same job over and over and over again, day after day, until they either died or walked out. And so they walked out. His $5 was about twice what his competitors were paying because his turnover rate was in the tens of thousands of %. People did a couple of weeks or maybe a few months at the most, and then they just upped and left. And because Henry had no idea how humans worked, he couldn't cope with the idea that they might need some kind of variation in their working day, much less some kind of connection with the unions. So he just simply tried to control every aspect of their lives whilst throwing money at the problem. Oh, and then he had to hire thugs to kick the fuck out of any union reps that might show up. He also hired people to turn up at your house to make sure that your wife wasn't working because, that's not good. Oh, shit, and there was one other thing that you had to do, one perfectly small, reasonable, no problem. You had to be not Jewish to get your $5 a day. Ford's anti-Semitism was insane. In 1918, he bought a paper called the Dearborn Independent, mostly so that he could publish stories about his political and business opponents whilst defending himself from various lawsuits. Again, that doesn't sound familiar to me at all. No one buys a media corporation specifically to do that shit, right? Okay. Anyway, in 1920, Ford realized that he could use this rag to go after people who'd started World War I so that they could profit from it. Oh, wait, no, hang on. No, that's not right. The Jews, yes, of course it was the Jews. The fact that in the whole of its history up to 1914, Henry had managed to sell 330,000 cars, which is impressive, but pales into comparison with what he sold between 1914 and 1918, which is the period of the World War. That would be 2.3 million vehicles. So clearly he hadn't made any money at all. It was all the problem of the Jews. You know those batshit crazy conspiracy theories that say central banks deprive people of money? Yeah, that was Henry. He started that. Have you ever heard of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? If you haven't, can I please encourage you to not Google it? It's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing, and the crap that they write will make your brains roll out of your ears. Suffice to say that this purports to be an account written by a Jew in an eyewitness situation where they are at a council which is trying to take the world over using, Jewish magic or something. It is in fact a fraud that was committed by the Russian intelligence services under the Tsars to justify suppressing a group of Jewish people who were attempting to impose democracy inside of Tsarist Russia. That went well. Anyway, it was so dumb and so gross, even the Nazi leadership knew that it was a fake, but it was an incredibly useful propaganda tool to them, so guess what? They used it. And guess how they got hold of this idea in the first place? Yep, that'd be Henry. For reasons of pure hate, he decided to publish the thing in 4 leather-bound volumes called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem in 1921. And in 1922, he had it translated into German. The whole concept of the Jewish question, which was framed by Ford, was then picked up by the Nazis for later use. And if you're one of those morons who thinks that the Nazis were socialist, then bear the following in mind. Adolf Hitler said, "I shall do my best to put his theories into practice in Germany," and he was speaking about Henry Ford. And in fact, he called out Ford directly in Mein Kampf as a great man and as someone who was holding the Jews back. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So, when you fuck around and you publish something like this, sooner or later you get to the Alex Jones or the Donald Trump phase, which we like to refer to as finding out. Soon enough, Henry got sued for being the colossal Charlie Unit November Tango, which was a problem because he had done exactly what he was accused of doing, and so he was going to lose. He therefore decided to interfere with witnesses, he got his editor to say that he'd had nothing to do with any of that Jewish stuff, and when all of that failed, he then faked a car crash to avoid having to take the stand. Nice. Anyway, Henry lost and in 1927 had to close the Dearborn, by which time this small little nationalist party in Germany had all the material that it needed to get super popular with other delusional nutjobs, and now you and I have to tiptoe around the bloody internet to avoid stepping in someone's racism. When Herr Hitler and his band of plonkers took over Germany, they got to enact some of Henry's ideas, not just the insanely repressive Nuremberg laws, but also a car for the people, which brings me to my next choice.
Holy shit! I knew Ford was a union-busting pillock and raving anti-Semite, but being referenced in Mein Kampf as an inspiration is some astronomical levels of evil. Christ. Well, okay, but if you want to talk about cars made by fascists, we have to talk about the OG, the Beetle.
Wait, no, you can't talk about the Beetle.
What do you mean I can't talk about the Beetle? We each picked 5 cars, and I picked the Beetle as my number 2.
Look, I picked the Beetle as number 2. It goes on from what I was talking about before.
Wait, you... I see what's happened here. Well, it's our fault for not coordinating.
All right, fine. How are we going to fix this?
I don't know. You just do your bit and I'll interject.
Okay, no, that works. All right. So it would, of course, be quite wrong for me to suggest that any group of people richly deserve a smack in the gob, no matter how much I think they might deserve it. Violence is not the answer, I'm told. The answer to what, you may ask? Well, perhaps the kinds of people who claim to have some moral high ground spend a lot of time judging others only to completely ignore their own flaws. I refer, of course, in this particular case, not just to Nazis and Trump supporters, but of course also to hippies. This next car somewhat improbably combines all 3 of those things. I refer, of course, to the Volkswagen Beetle, also known as the Kubelwagen, the Type 60, the Schwimmwagen, the Type 1, and many other names besides, but somehow it became beloved of the San Francisco hippies of the 1960s. Before boomers began voting for Captain Marmalade in large numbers, a goodly number of them spent their youths draft dodging, a bit like Donald himself, of course, wandering around wearing stupid clothes, spouting bollocks about Marx and Mao whilst living in their parents' 3-bedroom semi in darkest suburbia. What these Muppets knew about the working man's struggle, much less economics, could be written on the back of one of those fucking stupid beads that they wore in their hair to give life somewhere to hide when they were having their annual baths. Peace and love, shut the fuck off, you sanctimonious lentil-eating, pot-smoking bastards, and get a fucking job. Oh no, hang on, after your affordable education, you did all get jobs with wages high enough to be able to buy a house on, and are now mostly retired on final salary pensions with lots of time to browse the internet, buy into bullshit conspiracy theories, moan about immigration, and tell millennials that they eat too many avocados. The rot started with a specifically San Franciscan form of white trash, and then it went global. The counterculture, as it was styled, spent a lot of time creating a one-way sexual revolution and waving Mao's little red book around, just as Mao was starving roughly 30 million of his own subjects to death, and also claiming that America was an imperialist power whilst ignoring the 30-odd countries under direct Soviet rule. It is hardly surprising, then, that their chosen model of transport was a modified version of Hitler's answer to the Model T. These were the children of the generation that fought the war, and instead of stopping and asking themselves, gee, I wonder if Pop has any views on this natty staff car I'm getting stoned in, they carried on driving around these ridiculous vehicles. And to think, had they waited just a couple of years, they could have had the very fine Fiat 124, which of course went on to be adopted by the Soviet Union and became the Lada that we all know and laugh at. See, they could have actually had a Soviet product had they just waited about 18 months instead of a Nazi one.
The story of the Beetle is one made of a fabric of lies, politics, war, and self-justification, so typical of the Nazi regime as a whole. This is Ferdinand Porsche. Yeah, the one in the natty uniform, next to the clown with the stupid hair and the knockoff Chaplin stash. Attempts to defend him to protect the legacy of the Porsche name are frankly laughable. He was a member of the party and the SS, received a Totenkopfring as a personal gift from Himmler. He was a flaming pants-on-fire Nazi. He claimed to have designed the original Beetle, but as a Nazi it should come as no shock that he stole a sizable chunk of the ideas behind it from 2 guys. Bela Barany, who post-war would go on to pioneer passenger safety, and Hans Ledwinka, a chief designer at Tatra, whose V570 bears more than a striking resemblance to the Beetle. Both featured an aerodynamic design, both had rear-mounted air-cooled boxer engines, and just look at them, there was clearly some homework copying going on at some point. That's barely a joke, by the way. Porsche would later very politically state regarding Ledwinka, "I'd look over his shoulder and he'd look over mine," which I believe translates from bullshit as "I completely ripped him off, lol."
Yeah, you see, Porsche spent most of his time trying not to be hung as a war criminal post-war and getting sued by Bella and Tatra for various frauds well into the 1960s, including an out-of-court settlement in which VW paid Tatra more than 1 million Deutschmarks. Anyway, it often gets reported that Hitler himself got involved in laying down the precise specifications for the vehicle in 1934. It must be able to drive at 100 kilometers an hour for 4 hours, with 2 adults and 3 children on board, with an economy of 7 meters per 100 kilometers, with an air-cooled engine, and so on and so on and so on. Given what we know about Hitler, I find this highly implausible. Hitler would have said, "We need a people's car for moving the Volk around." And some bright little thing like Ferdinand Porsche will have looked over and heard and said, "Oh, I have this little car I've been working on since 1931. I reckon Papa H will fucking love this." At which point Hitler would have spent some time obsessing over the air cooling or over the indicator or some such bullshit before losing interest in doing something more interesting to do with guns. To back this up, note that Bella began his work on his concept in 1925 and Porsche began work on his only in 1931, and it wasn't until 1934 that Hitler was supposed to have laid these design details down. In other words, Hitler did what he always did and claimed someone else's ideas as his own.
Furthermore, we know Hitler liked Tatras. Their larger, more stately models were used by Czech officials, and on tours of Czechoslovakia, Hitler was ferried around in one, almost certainly a Tatra 77. The 77 also happened to feature an aerodynamic body with a rear-mounted air-cooled engine, except here it was a V8 because Tatra were really cool. It is reported that at one time Hitler told Porsche on the topic of Tatra that "This is the car I want for my roads, the kind of car I want for my highways." So is it really a coincidence that, knowing this, Porsche takes a general look at the design aspects of an economy car that Tatra happens to be developing at the time, and suddenly decides he's going to use the exact same design principles? I guess we'll never know. History is a tapestry of conflicting narratives, after all.
Things went quite well for a couple of years as Hitler consolidated his power, murdered his rivals, and passed the Nuremberg laws that disenfranchised all Jewish people. Porsche continued to try and get his cars running, and by 1938 he was basically ready. The people's car now rejoiced in the title of the Strength Through Joy car, which sounds crap in English but even worse in German, the Kraft durch Freudwagen, which absolutely rolls off the tongue, so let's call it the KDF wagon from here on out, okay? To make said car, Robert Lai, who was the head of DAF, was given the job. He was a man that would later go on to organise the mass use of slave labour and who sadly hung himself before the Allies could hang him. He was a war criminal and an absolute bastard, but at the time what he needed was a factory to produce the KDF wagon in. But this, of course, was the Nazi German state, so neither Hitler nor any of his cronies, much less Lai, had put money aside to, build the factory to build the car. Thus it was that they started to come up with a bit of a genius idea called the Sparkassen, or the savings book. This was Lai's idea, actually, in the first place. These were essentially token books. I mean, maybe a little bit unfamiliar to millennials. What you did is you paid 5 Reichsmarks a week for which you got a stamp, and you put your stamp in your book. Once you'd put 50 stamps in that book, it was completed. You needed to do that 4 times, and at the end of it, you could trade your 4 books in for a brand new car, which sounds absolutely brilliant. In a country where an average income was around 330 Reichsmarks a week for a household, this was perfectly doable, and some 26 million Germans rushed to take part. Except, in 1941, exactly no German citizens had received a car. The KDF plant was chucking out vehicles, versions of the Beetle indeed, the Schwimmwagen, the Kommandenwagen, the Kubelwagen, but almost no KDF wagon, certainly not for the masses, because the Sparkassen scheme was, drumroll please, a massive fucking scam which Robert Lai and various other Nazi leaders were using to treat as their own piggy bank. Oh, yeah, they did get their KDF wagons, by the way, but no one else did. So not just was a KDF wagon a kind of shitty car sort of designed by Hitler and lining the pockets of a man who would oversee the working to death of millions of slave labourers, it was also ripping off millions of ordinary Germans in the process who just wanted a car of their own. In short, it was an evil car made by evil people for an evil regime. And the gear change kind of sucked too.
Alright, so we messed up that last one pretty bad. Let's just make sure our number 1 picks are different. I'll count down 3, 2, 1, then we say our number 1 picks at the same time, alright? Okay. 3, 2, 1.
The Mercedes 600
Grosser. Fuck! Balls! Piss! Bollocks! Shitting bloody fucking hell! We're supposed to be professional YouTubers. How are we to expect our viewers to stick around when we mess up a bloody top 10 list?
Well, if you think about it, the fact that we both arrived at the same conclusion just means that we're both right. This must be the most evil car of all time.
Ah, yes, of course, we meant to do this. Well, seeing we both agree again, let's double-team this cast ingot of malevolence.
The Mercedes-Benz W100-600 Grosser is 21 feet long, or put it another way, that's longer than two Austin Minis put nose to tail. Weighing in at more than 4 tons, it used a 6.3-litre engine that essentially sucked in whole rainforests and shat out pure evil.
It had power windows, power seats, even power closing doors and boot lid, all features common among luxury cars today and nothing short of ludicrously excessive at the time. But this was the 1960s, so electrics would have been too unreliable. Therefore, all of what I just said were powered by a heinously expensive and complicated network of hydraulics. This had the added benefits of allowing the windows to close with such force as to literally remove appendages, but also being completely silent while doing so.
But that isn't actually why this car is evil per se. No, that's down to the owner's club. I mean, owning a thing doesn't necessarily make that thing evil, but at some point it stops becoming a coincidence and starts becoming a correlation. Let's just say that owning one of these things doesn't make you a dictator, but being a dictator vastly increased the chances that you owned one of these things. Representing the Reds, Premier of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982, invader of both Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan, the man with the most memorable eyebrows in history, that's right, is Leonid Brezhnev.
Notorious for tying up political prisoners with barbed wire and causing Romania's ongoing AIDS crisis, this Romanian strongman's wife claimed to be a chemist but literally didn't know what H2O stood for. That's right, it's Nicolae up against the wall Ceausescu.
Land of beautiful beaches, breathtaking hills, and a lot of unmarked graves, Albania is no one's idea of a holiday camp unless you like camping in hundreds of thousands of useless concrete bunkers. And that's because this man tortured 1 in 3 of his population to death. That's right, it's Enver Hoxha.
The man reputed to have a bendy willy who killed 30 million of his own people and is somehow revered as a deity in China today. It's Chairman Death to the Sparrows, Mao!
And let's not forget the sequel to the man that you know and love, the one you have to thank for setting China on its current path to modern state capitalism and that hellscape, and who led the People's Liberation Army during the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. It's the one, it's the only, Deng Xiaoping.
He put 2 fingers up to Stalin, led the most liberal Eastern Bloc country, stopped Yugoslavia detonating after World War II, and only brutally murdered tens of thousands when his contemporaries were in the millions. It's Tito!
North Korea's answer to the Kardashians, this father, son, and grandson team made war on their neighbors, starved their populations to death, and drank so much champagne and cognac whilst their people ate grass that LVMH gave them unlimited credit. It's the Kims, Il-sung, Jong-il, and Jong-un.
For the right wing, I give you Uganda's Big Daddy. He seized power in 1971 and never let it go. His past crimes include cutting people up with chainsaws and feeding them to crocodiles. Sadly, he died of old age in Saudi Arabia. It's Idi Amin!
Owner of the bushiest moustache on this list, daddy of all of the bastards. His hobbies included gassing his own people and letting his son torture the national football team when they lost. It's Saddam Hussein.
No list of other bastards would be complete without the Caribbean's answer to Pol Pot, who imprisoned about 20% of his population and killed perhaps 60,000 while stealing literally all of Haiti's money. He also started an internal race war in a nation descended from freed slaves. Give it up for Papa Doc Duvalier!
From the Philippines, we give you this honestly not a dictator, really not a dictator, despite leaving 2,500 dead people lying in the streets and tens of thousands of more disappeared. After his term in office, he managed to get out, somehow to Hawaii, with $1 billion worth of cash and jewels. It is, of course, Ferdinand Marcos.
Italy's proto-Trump, who mocked those made homeless by an earthquake, argued a 17-year comatose woman should be denied the right to die because she could still be impregnated, and tried to recruit a militia to protect him from being taken to court for tax fraud. It's Silvio Mussolini did almost nothing wrong, Berlusconi!
And almost last on our list of gross grocer owners, I give you the stupidest man from Iran who claimed the divine right to rule but died in an unsurprising exile. He was replaced by some equally odious fuckwits who held the Qurans up a different way, but as far as we know, don't own a grocer. It was, of course, the Shah of Iran.
Penultimately, we have Jeremy Clarkson, who is a bit mean about some people who don't like him very much and once got into a fight about a steak.
And to top things off for fun, beside owning 4 hippopotamuses and laying siege to his country's own Supreme Court, it is, of course, the candy-nosed one from Colombia, Pablo Escobar. Well, we hope that you enjoyed the not quite top 10 list of evilest cars of all time, and if you did, then please do feel free to sign up to Intergalactic Bin Man's channel. Unless you're watching this on Intergalactic Bin Man's channel, in which case, come and subscribe to me on my channel. This is all getting frightful. Just subscribe to everybody, all right? Have a lovely day.